Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I'm Vice President at the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular legislative update that we do every week to let everyone in our state know what's going on in the legislature, how these bills and votes and new policies that are going to be passed will affect the lives of everyone in Washington. And of course, we are engaged in presenting good policy ideas to encourage our government to move towards policies that improve the lives of the people of our state. So first off is we are just wrapping up the second week of session. So we're watching bills be introduced, tracking those. I thought we came across an interesting statistic that in Washington state, they've introduced 950 bills so far. Whereas in our neighbor in Idaho, they are also in session and the legislature there is now considering 15 bills. So Idaho seems to be much more streamlined in the way that they're governing their state. Washington has a huge number of bills, the vast majority of which will die in committee. And we're tracking which ones pass and which ones keep moving. The first cutoff date in the legislature is February 17th. And on that date, if a bill has not been voted out of committee, it's dead for the session. And then there are later cutoff dates that happen on the calendar as well. Of course, this is all contingent because the Democratic leadership of the legislature can always reach back and revive a bill that is technically dead and pass it in the last hours of the session. That's happened in the past. So no bill is ever dead until we get to the very last day of the session. So we keep that in mind as well. So our legislative staff, our analysts, our policy analysts have been involved in tracking legislation, particularly in weighing in on bills that we think are important that are already being debated in committee. So our experts testify, they provide objective, fact-based information to inform lawmakers about how these bills would impact people. And here are a couple of the ones that we've been working on. First, our education expert, Lee Finna, has been very busy, as she always is, because public education is a major focus of what the legislature does. And there are many bad ideas that would make public education worse, and we try to point that out. One fact that we note is that over 40,000 families have left the public education system in the last year or two. So when people vote with their feet, that tells you that there's something wrong with a government program. One of the ideas that she testified on was yet another proposal to punish school districts by cutting their funding by 20% if they did not teach CRT ideas and woke ideology in the classroom. Not only is this controversial in itself, but it violates the idea that schools are locally run. There are 295 school districts in the state, and the idea is a locally elected school board that's responsive to the community is supposed to decide what happens in public education and to meet state academic standards. So Lee testified against this bill, saying that school districts should not be threatened. They certainly shouldn't have their funding cut by 20% because they won't teach radical ideas. And that testimony went very well. An interesting thing she came across was a member of the committee, the ranking Republican Senator McCune, asked the chairman how many people had signed up to testify on the bill, pro and con. And the chairwoman, in this case, she dodged that question. So that made Lee very curious. And so she checked with the staff, and it turns out that 2 people had signed in to testify in favor of the bill, and like Lee testified against it, and she was joined by 1,227 other people who signed in through Zoom to testify against the bill. The committee couldn't hear from all of them, but it's interesting that the way people signed in indicated how the public thinks about this bill. She ran into the same thing regarding a bill, SB 5020, it's called, which would lower the mandatory school attendance age in our state from age 8 to age 6. So there will be a law that says that when a person got to be 6 years old, they have to be enrolled in school. This is considered to be a direct attack on homeschoolers. Also, an effort by the state to expand its market share against private schools, because state lawmakers know that many private schools do not have kindergarten, do not have preschool, and therefore it funnels kids into the public system. Lee testified against this, presented information as to why it's harmful to children, particularly very young in their development, to be forced into a classroom when maybe they're not ready for it, when it's not appropriate for their age. It takes flexibility away from the parents who know the child personally and know what's best. Many parents know that they may have one child who's ready for kindergarten at a certain age, but they decide to hold out a child for a year because they need more development. I will throw in a personal note that when my wife and I have worked with very young foster kids who are often developmentally delayed, even the state caseworker will say, this child should not be in a formal classroom yet. That person needs more time. So lowering the compulsory school age, we think, is the wrong approach, and therefore we oppose that idea. Next was a bill, SB 5054, which again, it's another degrading of the public school system. In this case, it would cut classroom instruction hours by 4 hours a week, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that means that students would be spending less time with teachers. One analytical point that Leave came across is teachers would instead be attending sessions for, quote, professional learning communities. One hint in our business is when new phrases or new words come up that you haven't seen before, it means that somebody is trying to hide something. And that's the case here. The sponsors of this bill are trying to reduce work hours for teachers. Of course, they don't want to say that. This bill is supported by the union. So they needed another phrase to put in there to say what teachers would be doing, since they wouldn't be teaching students. And that's where this phrase came from. Again, this bill is in committee. We'll see what happens with it. Next is a couple of victories that we have, and we're very proud of this. When the Democrats in the Senate passed the rules for the session, they included a permanent remote testimony Zoom way for people to participate in committee hearings. We have supported this idea for years, even before COVID came along. And now we see that the Senate has made it permanent. We hope that the House does the same thing. The reason is we live in a big state. It's hard for people to travel to the Capitol, particularly from Eastern Washington, to drive for hours to get to Olympia, to spend a few minutes in front of a committee. Most people don't have time for that, but they will sign in and express their views online. And as I noted earlier, they'll just sign in pro or con on the bill, and that way lawmakers are hearing from the public. We think that kind of transparency is a good thing. Next is we are encouraged that the Supreme Court is coming up with a hearing here next week in which they're going to consider the income tax bill that the legislature passed. As everyone knows, we've been following this issue very closely. Jason on our staff is the lead independent expert on this issue. Jason's research shows it very clear that this bill violates our state constitution. The irony for us is that Democrats enacted this bill. Democrats talk about defending democracy all the time. That is their major theme. And yet they just passed a bill that goes against our Constitution. So we're hoping that the Supreme Court will look at the text of the bill, read the clear meaning of the Constitution, and show that a constitutional amendment would be needed in order to have a progressive income tax in our state. So it's not off the table entirely, but there is a legal procedure that the legislature should follow, and they didn't do it in this case. We'll be seeing how that hearing goes next week. Next, we're doing a study on affordable housing. That is a major issue in this legislative session. The governor has made it a priority. Of course, his proposal is to spend $4 billion more in tax money to try to create affordable housing. Our approach is to cut the cost of supply. When builders pay less in fees, when the Growth Management Act is loosened so that there's more buildable land available, and when they lower taxes, then housing becomes more affordable. So as we see the pattern in other areas, policymakers should look at the cost that they create first before they turn around and make changes in the marketplace or create new subsidies. Another item that we looked at is the impact of the carbon tax that the governor signed a year or so ago. That is going into effect right now, January 1st. Carbon credits are supposed to be sold in an auction at the end of February. But what Todd has found out in his research is that gas prices in Washington state have already increased by 10 cents a gallon compared to other markets on the West Coast. So we're trying to have a very accurate measure here. That comes from an official source. And the governor was asked about this. Why are gas prices going up? Isn't it because of the new taxes that you signed and the energy and carbon taxes? And the governor's response was, he often takes an arrogant approach where he doesn't actually address the issue. He called that accusation baloney and said that it was nuts that anyone would think that gas prices were going up because of the bills that he signed. He pointed out that it hasn't even fully gone into effect yet, and that was his defense. That kind of shocked us because he's been governor for 10 years And he doesn't seem to understand that when you make a policy change and you announce a date when a new tax is going into effect, people anticipate that and have to start building in higher prices already. And that is exactly what's happening with the price of gasoline. We'll hope that the governor becomes a little more open-minded and maybe learns a little bit more about how his policies affect economics and the people of our state. Higher prices on gasoline are definitely coming, and they will be the result of the energy policy that we have adopted. With that, that's a pretty good rundown on the issues that we're doing. We have some great events coming up. We have our regular weekly Washington Policy Center on the Go live series on Facebook. I encourage you to attend that. And we have some fun events coming up on March 4th. Our top donors will be meeting at an event in Palm Springs. It's always a lot of fun. We have Jason Riley, an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, will be there speaking to our group. We have another event in Scottsdale, Arizona on March 11th with a great speaker there, Guy Benson, editor from Town Hall. These events are always a lot of fun. And people can sign up by looking at our website. And if you're able to attend, it would be great to see you there. And with that, I'll wrap up and I'll have another update next week. Thanks.